Telgemeier and Scott McCloud comes a one-of-a-kind novel. Meet Michaela, Howard, Linda, and Art. Together, they form the Cartoonists Club. Join them on a journey of creativity and comics magic. Make new friends and think outside the box, way outside. So if you have a story to tell, we've just got one thing to say. Welcome to the club, the Cartoonists Club.
Okay, hi Scott and Raina, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Douglas. How are you?
Doing good, thank you.
Yeah.
I think where I'd like to start first is if both of you individually would just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get to why you came together for this particular project. We'll start with you, Scott. Go ahead.
Well, I've been making comics for about 40 years, and I do the sort of things you expect. I wrote a little Superman, I wrote a superhero comic, but then at a certain point I started doing comics that are nonfiction, where I'm just facing the reader and explaining how stuff works. And I'm mostly known for explaining how comics works, for walking inside panels and talking about how our brains process what we see, that sort of thing. Think about like a BBC host in one of those mini-series where you're walking around ancient Rome and showing people stuff. It's things like that. So that's my bread and butter, is explaining the world through comics.
And I found comics when I was a kid in the newspaper. So I'm reading Calvin and Hobbes and For Better or For Worse and Peanuts. And then when I was a teenager, I read Scott's book, Understanding Comics. And it just really opened things up for me and made me even more so want to be a cartoonist. And I started writing and illustrating graphic novels about 20 years ago. I'm best known for memoir work, so books like Smile and Sisters and Guts. And throughout that whole time, I've engaged young readers so much that all of them ask me the same question, which is, how do you do this? How do you begin? What's the secret? And I kept wishing that there was a book like Understanding Comics that would be suitable for the average 8-year-old to read. And then it occurred to me a few years ago that I needed to make that book and I needed to ask Scott to be my co-author. So we put our heads together, and it took a few years, but we figured out what that meant, and it's the Cartoonists Club.
Graphic novels or comic books have been around for a long time. What would you say the primary difference is between the ones that came out in the 1950s and 60s to the ones that are out today, if anything?
There are so many differences. I mean, one is just length. I mean, it was a big deal during my career when we started making comics that you could stand up on one end. Comics with the spine, things that were books, 300 or 400 pages. And it took a while for us to kind of get into the rhythm of it. For a while, we were just doing the same kind of storytelling that we always did. But gradually, people discovered that there's all these opportunities in that format to tell slower stories, to tell stories that, just like TV has evolved, comics has evolved too. But also there's a diversity of subjects, diversity of, the kinds of styles and stories that you can tell. And comics just exploded in a million directions. It wasn't just graphic novels either. It was also comics on the internet and the sort of people who are making comics. Comics really reinvented itself.
How long has anime been around?
Well, actually, anime, which basically when we say anime, we're talking about Japanese animation. And, I think it goes to the early 20th century, about the same time as animation began in America. It wasn't that long before they started doing it in Japan, too. But just like Manga, which is Japanese comics, they had their own way of making comics. And, comics evolved in a really exciting way in Japan. And I think in recent years, we've been learning a lot from the way the Japanese make cartoons and make comics.
I think manga was the word I was looking for, not anime. But
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're both. I mean, we enjoy both. We enjoy Japanese cartoons and Japanese comics.
Well,
But you're right that manga, it's just the Japanese word for comics.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, how influential were those on work that's being done in the West now? I mean, have they made...
Oh, it's
Go ahead.
It's humongous. I'd say that I don't want to draw huge percentages, but I feel like 75% of what's popular now is inspired by kids who grew up with anime and manga. And I was just slightly too old for that wave. I was in my late teens and early 20s when this sort of manga boom happened, which is when you'd have teenagers sitting on the floor at your local Borders bookstore, reading volume after volume. But I actually read a manga called Barefoot Gen when I was 10 years old, which was kind of a telling from the first person of what it was like to live through the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, which is pretty dense stuff for a 10-year-old kid, but it's just what I happened to have at the time. And it changed my life because up till then, I thought comics were funny pages, comic strips and jokes and laughter. And then I read this book and it was so sad. And I was like, oh my gosh, this medium is so powerful for telling stories. Not that I want to create sad stories, but that I want to create stories that have an impact someday. And I was, 10. So I filed that all away into the back of my mind for later. But the style of storytelling, and what I mean by that, not just the art style, but like the pacing of the stories is really specific. You get a lot of quiet space in manga that we didn't have as much of in the United States in the middle part of the 20th century. But I think a lot of the newer artists have like adapted to that. And so you see a lot more quiet, a lot more pauses, and just kind of like nature and clouds floating through the sky. And I think of those as very Japanese.
Yeah. I became interested in manga when I got my very first job in comics just out of college. It was very near to a Japanese bookstore, and I started reading that stuff. It was in the original Japanese. I didn't know a word of Japanese, but I knew how to read pictures.
Right.
And I learned all about these different techniques. And when people were saying, oh, this stuff isn't real, it'll never catch on in America, I was one of the early, champions of that art form. And I saw that it could have an effect. And just like Raina, when those kids were sitting cross-legged in their local bookstores reading manga, I just thought, this is going to change the way comics are made. And sure enough, it did. And Raina was one of the reasons that it changed everything.
Well, I think the big difference from when I was a kid growing up until now is there is a lot more graphic novels for adults, because comic book was synonymous with kids' books. People who were adults didn't read them, or at least pretended not to, or something like that. But they were designed for kids. And now you've got graphic novels that are for everybody, all ages, all different subject matters.
We're talking about two distinct revolutions, because first, in the 80s, my generation had to demonstrate that comics weren't just for kids anymore. And then in about 10, 20 years later, Raina's generation came along and started making comics for kids, and they became popular with kids again.
Yeah. We've got just a couple minutes left, so let's get over to the Cartoonists Club. Tell us about this book.
Sure. It's a fictional story. It's about 4 kids who come together. They form a club at their school. Their librarian is the one who kind of inspires them to get together. They're all coming from 4 different types of like creativity, and where does one begin, and what's your art style, and so they're all about different approaches, but they come together and sort of inspire each other, and that helps them all figure out how to make work. But it's more than that, because along the way, they are figuring stuff out and showing the reader how it works. And they make mini comics together. They play a bunch of different games. And so the reader can play along. But then as the book really goes off the rails, their librarian, Miss Fatima, is the one who's sort of taking them in and out of the comics panels and showing them how this language really works. And that's where Scott's influence really comes in. He's so good at explaining things that I wanted there to be a way to talk about these things within the context of the story. So it's quite meta in some places, but at the end of the day, it still is about these 4 characters and about the journey that they are on as readers. And we hope that our readers of the book will sort of feel like they're involved and that they're kind of a part of this club as well.
Yeah.
Is this a how-to? I mean, would you call it like that? If you gave it to the reader and say, this is kind of showing you how to do a comic book?
Well, that's an important question, Douglas, because I think it started out as more of a how-to, but in the end, it really evolved as we worked on it to be much more about the kids discovering for themselves how they wanted to make comics, not some adult explaining to them how to do it. There's some explanation, and their library media specialist helps them out with some things that they couldn't find out on their own. But a lot of it is about them discovering their own path. And that's really important because one of the most important messages we had to convey to them was that there are no rules. There's no one right way to make comics. And we want kids to learn that. Maybe first and foremost, we want them to know that there's no one magic formula, that it's a journey you have to take on your own, and that every kid is going to have a different story to tell, and every kid is going to want to tell their story in a different way.
Is this the first time you two work together?
Yes.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Why did you decide to do it as a collaboration?
Well, I think that, Raina had this tremendous audience, and I had this book, Understanding Comics, in the 90s, where I explained how it worked. And we wanted to marry the two. We just wanted to have a chance to share those ideas from my books with Raina's audience, and that's exactly what we did.
Okay. Are you going to do another one together?
We'll see. We'll see how the first one does first.
Okay. Well, I think on that, we're going to have to wind this down. Thank you so much for coming on the show. The book is called The Cartoonists Club. Has it been released?
April 1st.
Tomorrow,
April 1st,
is it?
okay.
Yeah.
Tomorrow. It comes out tomorrow.
Okay.
Or,
Very good.
It may not be tomorrow when we broadcast.
You want to quickly each give out your websites?
Sure. I'm found everywhere at Go Raina. So that's GORAINA.com, at Instagram, Blue Sky, all of the places.
And I'm at Blue Sky at Scott McCloud, as Scott McCloud, and also scottmccloud.com.
Okay, great. Well, Raina and Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure meeting you. Best of luck. And
Thank you, Douglas.
hopefully we see more work between you two.